Hey there, this is Rocky from businesswritingtutorials.com, and welcome to a new mini-series. The last mini-series looked at some issues with punctuation. In this mini-series we're going to look at some issues of grammar, and today's lesson will focus on the issue of misplaced modifiers. Misplaced modifiers are common in all kinds of writing, but they're particularly problematic in business writing, academic writing, and other technical writing, which all favor high levels of specificity and precision. And misplaced modifiers, as you'll see, cause some illogical and unintended meanings. So that would be very imprecise, of course. Alright, so before we can understand what a misplaced modifier is, we have to understand what a modifier is. And a modifier is simply an element of a sentence that describes another element of a sentence. So a modifier could be a word, could be a phrase or a clause, and the described element could also be a word, a phrase, or a clause. Examples of modifying words are adjectives. The pen is black. The adjective black describes the word pen. Adverbs are also modifying words. They usually end in ly, but not always, and they usually describe verbs, but not always. So, for example, I spoke too quickly. The adverb quickly describes the action of speaking. Phrases can also be modifiers. We saw some examples of phrases in the comma lesson, and there are many types, of course: prepositional, participial, infinitive, and others. And adjectives and adverbs can also form whole phrases, and as opposed to just being single words. As I mentioned before, it's less important that you can name the type of phrase, and more important that you can just identify that there is a phrase in the sentence and that it's doing some sort of descriptive duty, describing something else in the sentence. So here we have an abbreviated version of one of the examples we used in the comma lesson. Driving by night, I reached my destination. And the phrase driving by night modifies I and provides some context for the rest of the sentence. I'm not going to go into too much detail just yet because it'll get confusing without more context. We'll go into plenty of examples. Modifying elements can also be clauses, and clauses can also be the modified element. I intentionally left an example out here because some of the same principles apply between phrases and clauses, and it's less important that you can identify the difference between a phrase and a clause at this point, and more important that you can make sure that your sentences are accurate and logical. Okay, so what is a misplaced modifier? Well, of course, misplaced modifier is just a modifier that's in the wrong place. What does that mean? Well, it means that your modifier is describing the wrong sentence element. Let's take a look at some examples of starting with modifiers as words. So one common word that's often put in the wrong place is the word only. For example, I only ran 1 mile. It sounds perfectly fine when you first listen to it. You'll notice that in a lot of these examples, the word that's being modified comes right after the modifier. So this is our problem with the word order. In this case, the word only modifies ran. So what it actually means is that you didn't bike or swim or jog or walk a mile. You just ran and didn't do any other action. That's okay if that was the intended meaning, but more likely the writer meant to say he or she ran only 1 mile. And hereby putting our 1 mile right after the modifying word, the only applies to the distance and not to the action of running. So this is probably what was meant to be said. So one quick solution that you're going to see over and over is that you should often put your modified element right after the modifier. This will clarify any problems or clarify any potential ambiguity. Another word that's commonly misplaced is the word almost. I almost ate a whole pizza. Again, we speak in misplaced modifiers so frequently that this sounds perfectly fine when you first listen to it. But let's take a closer look. The word almost defines the word that comes right after it, which is ate. And so what this means is that you thought about eating a whole pizza, but you decided not to. That might even mean that you didn't eat any pizza that night. To fix this, we have to switch our word order. Just by moving the word almost after the word ate, now it modifies the next element in the sentence, which is a whole pizza. And that actually means that you ate 6 or 7 slices, but you didn't finish it. It's amazing how just this little change can change the entire, this little change in word order can change the entire meaning of the sentence. So basically when you have some element like a word that's modifying some other element, try not to stick other words and phrases in between the two. That's the problem that happened here and in the previous example. We had a word stuck in between the modified and the modifier, or the modifier and the modified. Okay, so let's look at some examples of phrases. These can be a little trickier. Not really because the issue is different so much, but they're just longer, and so it seems a little more complex. Phrases can often become misplaced when the subject is missing from the sentence, either in the phrase itself or after the phrase, or the modifying phrase is far away from whatever it's modifying. And it's the same thing with the words we saw. We don't want to stick other material in between the phrase and whatever it's describing. Let's look at some examples. Here's an example of when a phrase with a missing subject after the phrase. That sounds a little confusing. I just realized as I was reading it. Okay, so after searching everywhere, the keys turned up. Well, first we have to identify our phrase. Do we have to know that this is a prepositional phrase? No, we don't have to. But do we have to identify that there is a phrase? Sure. And so we have some collection of words here that's providing some detail or context to the rest of the sentence or to some specific part of the sentence. Okay, this phrase here, after searching everywhere, describes the next element, which is the keys. That means that the keys were actually running around doing the searching. Of course, that's illogical, so we would have to add something in. In this case, the problem is that we didn't specify who was doing what. And that's the other main solution to our problem, is to always specify who's doing what action our sentence is. This is simply clear and will also avoid problems of illogical structures like this. So in this case, we have the same phrase, and we just stick the word I in here. Now we need a verb. After searching everywhere, I found the keys. You'll find that if you favor this green arrow should go all the way over to the I. You'll find that if you favor active voice over passive voice, you'll solve a lot of these problems without even having to try too much. We'll go over active and passive voice in another lesson, but if you want to search for that for some more information, in the meantime, that would be fine. Okay, another example. In this case, we could add the subject right into the phrase itself. While cleaning the living room, a mouse scurried across the floor. Here's our phrase. It modifies the next element, a mouse. And of course that means that the mouse was actually cleaning the living room. The mouse was doing the action here. We can fix this in a couple of different ways. I just wanted to show you a different way to fix it. One would be to add in the word I, or whoever was cleaning, into the actual phrase itself. Doing that would give it a subject-verb pair and would technically turn it into a clause. That's why I added the word clause in parentheses here. But the main idea is just that we have to clarify who's doing what. We could also fix this by saying, while cleaning the living room, I saw a mouse scurry across the floor. That would also be fine. The word I would come right after the clause, or that phrase, so it would be easy to understand. Okay, so a lot of times you'll see these misplaced modifiers, misplaced modifying phrases at the beginning of sentences, especially phrases that start with an ing word or that contain an ing word. Those are notoriously prone to creating misplaced modifiers. However, there are other kinds of phrases and phrases at in different parts of the sentence. So the main issue is that they have to be close to whatever they're modifying. Okay, let's look at a case of a phrase at the end of a sentence. She handed out brownies to the children stored in Tupperware. Again, if you listen to it quickly, maybe it doesn't seem strange, but let's take a look at what our phrase is, stored in Tupperware, and this refers to the closest element, which is the children. So that actually means the children stored in the Tupperware. Pretty freaky. Alright, so we need to fix that one, of course. She handed out brownies stored in Tupperware to the children. And so now we have our stored in Tupperware closer to the children. Another way to fix this would be probably just to rewrite it. She stored brownies in Tupperware and handed them out to the children would be better. So sometimes, too, it's not just the order. You can just completely rewrite your sentence and fix some issues. Alright. Let's look at another one of a misplaced modifier at the end of the sentence. Actually, this one looks like it's in the middle of the sentence. Okay. I smelled the oysters coming down the stairs for dinner. Our phrase coming down the stairs refers to closest element, the oysters. And, of course, that means that the oysters were actually alive and had 2 legs and were walking down the stairs. And the problem here, again, is that we stuck something in between our phrase and what it was modifying, which is I. So there's a couple ways, of course, that we could fix this. Coming down the stairs, I smelled the oysters, and I just added in some more clarity here. Joe was cooking for dinner. And what did we do? Well, we made sure we didn't have anything between our modifying phrase and what it was modifying. We could also fix this by saying, let's say, as I was coming down the stairs, could be, I smelled the oysters that Joe was cooking for dinner as I was coming down the stairs. There's a couple, actually had something else in my head, and it sounded better before. I don't know where it went, but okay, brain collapsed there for a second. But in any case, the idea is that whatever solution you pick, you want to make sure that your modified element and your modifying element are close together. Okay, so we've seen some different examples of misplaced modifiers, but how do you actually avoid them in your writing? Well, there are a couple things you can do. The first thing is that you should always let your document sit, not just for this issue, but for everything. It's easier to catch your punctuation mistakes, spelling mistakes, substantive mistakes in the accuracy of the material, fix your preciseness, or improve your preciseness, I should say, and fix other errors. So if you can let it sit overnight, that's great. If you can let it sit longer, that's even better. And what that does is that while you're writing, you have all the connections in your head, and sometimes those connections aren't apparent to readers. When you let your document sit overnight or for a couple days, your brain sort of forgets some of those connections and has to reestablish them, so you're like another reader looking at it. Of course, it's not always the same as another reader looking at it because you'll still have some ideas in your head. But at least with fresh eyes, your brain's forced to do a little more work, and as it's putting the ideas back together, you'll start to see sometimes when there's illogical connections or things out of order. Of course, the other thing is that you have to know some of these patterns, and by watching these lessons and studying a little on your own and researching some things, you'll have more information of patterns to look for. Okay, well, one of the other ways that you want to, or that you can avoid these misplaced modifiers is to simply always specify who's doing what in your sentence. We saw a few different examples of where just leaving out the word I, or of course it was he or she or a person, that caused the problem. So always say who's doing what action, and you'll solve a lot of the problems without even having to try so much. Try to favor active voice over passive voice, and also try to use clear subjects. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes the word it or another vague pronoun could be a subject of your sentence, but it's often unclear what the word refers to. So try not to use it as a sentence, especially after a phrase. Those opening phrases that we saw, if you have like an ing phrase, and then the very next word is it, that's almost always going to result in a misplaced modifier, or at least some sort of ambiguity. So try to be clear, specify who you're talking about. The third way to avoid these misplaced modifiers, or catch them after you've written them, is to keep your modifying word, phrase, or clause as close as possible to the modified word, phrase, or clause. Again, we saw some examples of that, where just a matter of putting your adjective or your adverb or your phrase right before whatever it's modifying. It can also come after, but just make sure it comes right after and doesn't have any words or phrases or material in between. Let's look at one last example to show how just even adding in a subject might not be enough if you have some extra words in between. With the brightness set on high, I watched a movie on my tablet. Our phrase with the brightness set on high modifies I. The problem is that I don't have brightness setting. My tablet has a brightness setting. So I could fix this in a couple of ways and say something like, I set the brightness on my tablet to high and watched a movie. With the brightness on my tablet set on high, I watched a movie. Lots of different ways that you could do it, but just make sure we're not sticking something in between. One of the places where I got a couple of the examples for these misplaced modifiers was from this website here, which is the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Writing Center. There's a couple of other funny ones here. You can search Google or whatever search engine you use for misplaced modifiers, and you'll see a bunch of lists like this. A couple more. Driving like a maniac. The deer was hit and killed. Well, we have our phrase driving like a maniac, and it modifies the deer. Of course, the deer wasn't doing the driving. So you'd have to do what? Well, this is a case of a missing subject. Driving like a maniac, I hit and killed the deer. Another example, kind of similar, I saw the dead dog driving down the interstate. That means you saw a ghost version of a dog driving a vehicle. So you would have to, so here we have our phrase down the interstate, or driving down the interstate, I'm sorry. And to fix that, we could say, while I was driving down the interstate, I saw a dead dog, or something like that. And there's lots of examples here. You can take a look at them. I got here this oyster example was in the presentation, and the one with the Tupperware. Another one, I brushed my teeth after eating with Crest toothpaste. That means you were eating with a human version of Crest. So this example, we have stuck something in between our modified and our modifying elements. So instead you could say, after eating, comma, I brushed my teeth with Crest toothpaste. And there's many more. You can take a look at them. Also search online. Search for misplaced modifiers or dangling modifiers, and you'll get plenty of pages. This one I just pulled up was one of the first ones I saw, but I thought it had some clear examples. I'm not sure what site it is. Capital Community College Foundation. They did a nice job here in changing the oil every 3,000 miles. The car seemed to run better. That actually means that the car was changing its own oil. So changing the oil every 3,000 miles. Fred found he could, and this is an example of putting in your subject. So again, we see the two common areas where we have either a missing subject, so it's not clear who's doing what, or we just have some material in between our modified and modifying elements. These expletive constructions often are the it is phrases or there is phrases. I already mentioned the issue of it. There is, which we talked about in a previous lesson, can also be unclear. So changing the oil every 3,000 miles, there is an easy way to keep your car running smoothly. It's just not clear what there is referring to or who's doing the maintenance. So if we change the oil every 3,000 miles, we can keep our car running smoothly. Here we clarified the subject. And there's some examples of active and passive voice. So you can take a look at this and then again search online, get some other examples for yourself to help clarify. And as always, please feel free to ask me questions if you have them. Good luck with your writing, and try to let your documents sit for a night or two before you really analyze them. Take a look with fresh eyes and see if you can identify some areas where your word order is not as precise as it could be. Good luck, and again, feel free to ask any questions that you have.